Welcome to the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Welcome to those of you who haven't been here before. Yesterday, we celebrated our 50th birthday. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary. Yay! From the day that Congress passed into law the establishment of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Now, the Canada Institute, which many of you are aware of, is not 50 years old. Actually, the Canada Institute was started in it was established in 2000. It was as a result of a letter that Ramon Chrétien, former Canadian ambassador to the U.S., sent to Lee Hamilton in 1999 saying, hey guys, what's up? Canada-US, that's an important relationship. Why isn't there a Canada Institute at the leading international center for scholars and scholarly research? So we have been around for 28 years and I think about 28 years, yeah. We are the small but mighty Canada Institute. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute, a misplaced or displaced Calgarian, come by way of Ottawa, which is a really good place to get lost. And I've been running the Institute for just over 3 years now, and it is a crazy and wonderful place to be. This program came to us as a result of our bridge building efforts here, in which we as the Canada Institute attempt to provide a bridge between Canada-US issues. Not necessarily always high foreign policy issues, but technical issues, community issues, economic issues. We firmly believe that the world, and especially Washington, needs more Canada. So a number of our American government partners came to us and said, you know, we would really like to understand better First Nations relationships in Canada. We understand that there's some important things happening there, and we would like to see and understand better how that is working and how that works out. And fortunately for us, we have a number of great corporate partners as supporters of the Canada Institute, including Enbridge and Suncor, and on this program as well, Wells Fargo. And these folks are also deeply engaged in these in important partnerships. So we've been speaking to our private sector partners and our government partners, and have been able to put this program together. I'm pretty sure it's the first of its kind in Washington, and we have also to thank not just Suncor, Enbridge, and Wells Fargo, but also our partners at the Embassy of Canada, Rachel and Aaron and her team, and the Alberta office at the embassy as well. Liam and Jetin have been great partners and advisors in putting this thing together. So hello and welcome. That's what it says on my notes. Say that first. Secondly, say hello to the webcast audience. Hello. We are going to be an audience of various sizes today, but in addition to the folks you see around you, we are simulcasting this out to all the ships at sea. And we will have the recording, the digital recording of this event available on our website afterwards. So, hello. Yes. In today's program, we're challenged to consider. Usually, we do Canada-U.S. issues writ large, but in today's program, we're challenged to consider not just the Canada-US dimension, but also the unique contributions of Indigenous communities as sovereign and distinct entities. And so for each of the panels today, the legal, the financial, and industry panel, it was really important to us to have Indigenous perspective wherever possible, and Indigenous partners speaking on these issues. This is frankly a new area of inquiry for us. I hope you will let us know afterwards what you think, how well it works, what we could be doing better. But I hope it's the first of many opportunities that we have to explore Indigenous issues and partnerships. And I look forward to learning a lot today. I'm going to be the ringmaster and the air traffic controller, but the experts and the analysts are going to be on stage doing the heavy lifting. In addition, I wanted to recognize Bob Rae, who is right there in the center. Bob Rae, former Premier of Ontario, and now very, very well known internationally as an activist and as an advocate on behalf of many, many important things, including Indigenous issues in Canada. So welcome, Bob. We're delighted to have you here. I'm delighted to have you all here. So for the first panel, I would like to invite, I'd like to invite the first panel to come up while I give a brief introduction. At the door, you will have seen the biographies so that you can have a longer introduction. No, I'm not going to play Eye of the Tiger while you guys all jog up here. So just in any order, come on up, Olga, Gare, Brenden, and Liam. Well, I tell this group, come on up, have a seat. Well, I tell this group who we've got. So the moderator for the panel is Liam, who's on page 4 or 5. Smith, last guy on here. Liam Stonesmith, managing director of the Alberta Washington office, and he oversees office operations and focuses on the energy and environment issues that are critical to Alberta's relationship with the United States. And he's a great guy and an inveterate cyclist and a great friend to Canada Institute as well. Who comes? Oh, thank you. $1.30 in Canadian. All right. And sitting to his left, Gare Smith, a partner at Foley Hoag. Gare founded the firm's corporate social responsibility and human rights practices. He advises corporations and Indigenous nations and peoples on legal, political, and economic aspects of globalization and crisis management, including developing rights-oriented codes of conduct, compliance programs, and monitoring systems. He's got a super interesting background, and I invite you to ask him about it. Olga Puntus is the Senior Vice President, Environmental and Social Risk Management, Sustainability, and Corporate Responsibility for the Wells Fargo Company. In that position, Olga leads their efforts to understand customers' environmental and social impact and performance and manages environmental and social risks across the enterprise. Olga comes to us from Belarus by way of New York City. And last but not least, so I was on the phone the other day. Actually, I wasn't on the phone. It was this device. I get a text message from our great scholar, Ronna Ambrose, who some of you know is Canada's former leader of the opposition, and she lives in Calgary. And she says, "You got to meet this guy, Brenden Hunter. He is awesome. He is exactly the guy that you should be talking to about First Nations issues." And turns out she's correct. We've got Brenden Hunter, who's a partner at Fasken, which is a law firm in Canada. You're based in Calgary, right, Brenden? Yep. And also a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. He practices regulatory, Indigenous, and environmental law, assisting electrical generators, utilities, pipeline owners, oil and gas producers, telecommunications companies, and other project proponents. So if the lights ever go off or your telephone stops working, call Brenden. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, my able moderator, and I'll sit over at the far side and wave at you from time to time. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I feel like a Canada Centre dialogue on energy, people should know Alberta, but I'm just going to give you a little spiel anyway. Alberta is Canada's energy province, so oil, gas, solar, wind energy. We've got growing production across both the traditional fossil energy and in renewables. And really, I'm pleased to be here today because that growth is being driven by our private sector, and it's great that we have Enbridge and Suncor here to talk about what they're doing in this space and some of the partnerships really that are breaking new ground as they partner with our Indigenous communities in Alberta and then in Canada and the United States. So really a privilege to moderate a panel that is supposed to set the stage. And so with that, I'll just maybe turn it over to Gare to sort of give us a 30,000 foot level view, and then we'll move down the line with some opening comments.
Well, thank you, Liam. It's a pleasure to be here today, and my hat's off to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Laura, thank you for being sufficiently prescient to hold this forum on a very important topic. If we harken back 25 years ago to what we might euphemistically call the dawn of globalization, the concept of corporate social responsibility emerged as a way that businesses could address challenges in developing economies that had very limited rule of law and were generally lacking in governments. And if you were to work in these countries and simply follow the rule of law, it would not be sufficient to ensure that workers' rights were addressed. It would not be sufficient to ensure that the environment was appropriately watched. And it would most certainly not be sufficient to ensure that people's rights, and particularly the rights of indigenous peoples, were respected. To deal with this challenge, new norms and standards had to be developed internationally to fill the gap with the law. One of the most important of these was the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which was developed under Professor John Ruggie and accepted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. According to the guiding principles recognize that all businesses, no matter how large, how small, or what country you're operating, are required to respect human rights. And one of the ways you can fulfill that responsibility is ensuring that you conduct due diligence on the activities that you would likely undertake that could negatively impact the human rights of the peoples with whom you would be working. Corporate social responsibility has been my profession for the past 25 years, and for much of this time, I've worked in emerging economies. I've spent a lot of time in places like Sudan and Equatorial Guinea and Gabon and Papua New Guinea, where you have very limited rule of law and where the rights of indigenous peoples are pretty much on the bottom of the totem pole. Recently, however, these challenges have come home to roost in the U.S. and Canada in a very significant way. Here, as with the emerging economies, simply complying with the minimum guidelines of the rule of law is not always sufficient to demonstrate respect for human rights, and particularly the rights of indigenous peoples. From a business perspective, it's also not sufficient to manage a company's reputational and operational risks, or if you're a bank, the risk that you're going to come with lending. And this is particularly true, of course, with the rights of indigenous peoples in light of our long and quite tragic history in both the United States and Canada, where the rule of law has been used more for oppression than protection. Expectations today are changing not only among indigenous peoples, but also with courts, with regulators, and with the public regarding how and when proponents of energy projects should consult with indigenous peoples. If there's one lesson that we can all learn from the Dakota Access Pipeline, from Depo, is that the law has not kept pace with these expectations. Nor does compliance with the law necessarily provide companies with enough certainty and predictability to operate successfully. Laws change, court cases come out in very unexpected ways. We've seen that quite recently in both Canada and the United States. And moreover, compliance with the law is absolutely no guarantee that a company will have the social license to operate that it needs to mitigate risks and be successful. So DOPL serves as a wake-up call to lenders of the risks associated with that simple compliance-based approach in the face of changing public expectations. Because should companies fail to meet the expectations they have of the companies, the creditors face serious financial risks and reputational harm. And I'm sure many of you are aware that during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, many of the banks that made loans were picketed. Some had adverse shareholder resolutions. And afterwards, they were very concerned. They said, what are the lessons learned? What can we take from this? How can we ensure we're not in a situation that's like this again? And they came and they commissioned my law firm to create a paper on good best practice for dealing with indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. And anyone who's interested in reading it, it's on the a summary is on the Foley Hoag website. You can look it up. I'll talk about a couple of the pieces of it today. But what was most interesting to me in developing it, that guidance, was how things have come completely full circle. The norms and the best practices that were developed to address how the impacts of financing decisions in emerging economies are now equally applicable here in North America, in Canada and the United States. For example, the IFC's environmental and social performance standards and the Equator Principles are excellent frameworks for banks to consider when and how to finance projects that impact indigenous peoples. These frameworks are particularly helpful because they reflect the new international norms that fill the gaps with U.S. law. As one very simple but very important example, both the IFC standards and the Equator Principles refer not only to the need to consult with indigenous peoples, but the need under certain circumstances to secure free, prior, and informed consent. And of course, that's the guideline established under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that's been accepted by both the United States and Canada. Our good practice guidelines are detailed to help the banks follow emerging expectations. They're rather lengthy, but I'll just put forward three this afternoon. One, and first and foremost, is the importance for banks conducting due diligence on the social and environmental impacts of the projects they're financing with respect to Indigenous peoples. Now, that due diligence can be de novo, which means they can do it independently on their own, or it can be assessing how well that the company they're considering making the loan to has done it already. This is important for several reasons. First, obviously, it's a demonstration by the bank that they care about the human rights of the impacted peoples. But secondly, again, from a business management perspective, by conducting the due diligence, you're able to identify what potential risks there are to human rights and what potential human rights impacts there are so that you can then create mitigation standards. Second, our report notes that Indigenous communities often lack the resources and the capacity to engage meaningfully. Quite often. This challenge has many roots, and many of you are well familiar with them, but the financial sector can play a key role in helping overcome it by building Indigenous people's capacity to engage in an effective manner. Third, it's increasingly common for companies to ensure that a project's negative impacts are simply outweighed by its benefits. Impact-benefit agreements between companies and Indigenous peoples are a classic mechanism for doing this, and they're very simple. Identify the project's potential risks to Indigenous peoples, propose mitigation mechanisms, and guarantee concrete benefits. These benefits can include cultural preservation, community investment, employment, procurement, and other things. And although companies bear primary responsibility for negotiating these agreements, banks can incentivize them and ensure that the project impacting Indigenous peoples bring tangible benefits. So looking ahead, I think we can see that the banks are going to be at the center of the debate about projects they consider financing in the future. And in my judgment, the kinds of challenges raised by the Dakota Access Pipeline protests are more likely to become the norm than the aberration. Since the financial sector has leverage over many different actors in this process, pressure on banks to consider non-financial factors in their decision-making process is only going to increase. Now, unless you came here today from a different planet, you're probably aware that we have midterm elections coming up here in the United States in 2 weeks. And it's quite possible that whoever wins, whatever party comes into power, will make as a priority seeking to close that gap between U.S. law and international best practices. That would be a welcome step. But either way, whoever comes into power and whether they address the law and seek to improve it sooner or later, financial institutions can get right ahead of the curve right now by looking at the international best practices, seeking to implement it, and ensuring it's part of their decision-making process in making loans.
Thank you. So now we'll turn it over to Brenden, who can bring, I think, a Canadian perspective to this discussion.
Thanks, Liam. I guess the lens that we look at the duty to consult in Canada is quite different than what Gare just described in relation to the U.S. In Canada, the duty to consult is not a gap in law. It's not founded in corporate social responsibility. It's a constitutionally enshrined right that we've had built into our Constitution, Section 35, since 1982. That section said that the Constitution affirmed and recognized existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. So we've now had in Canada over 35 years of case law with courts grappling with what that means. What do energy proponents have to do when they're out there developing a project? What does the Crown have to do? When I talk about the Crown, I'm talking about both the federal government as well as the provincial government. We had a very major decision in 2004, and that came from our Supreme Court of Canada. It was the Haida decision. And a lot of the question marks were answered, and we still look back to Haida in our day-to-day practice. And what that decision told us was, whenever the Crown's going to contemplate conduct that could adversely affect a Aboriginal or treaty right, and the Crown's on notice of a real or asserted Aboriginal or treaty right, the duty of consult would be triggered. At law, at that point, the Crown's got a duty to speak with Indigenous groups who have those rights that may be affected. For treaty rights, a lot of Canada is covered in treaty. The Crown already knows that those rights exist. They're a party to those treaties, so it's a given that they have to go and speak with Indigenous groups who exercise rights in that area of the country. So, and when I talk about treaty rights, we're talking about stuff like hunting, fishing, trapping. Those were rights that were substantively given to Indigenous groups through the treaties. There's also other Aboriginal rights. It could be medicine collecting or berry collecting, all sorts of different things. The Haida, cedar forests, using them for canoes, for totem poles, that type of thing. So when we think about doing a project in Canada, the biggest risk to any energy project is whether you've satisfied that duty to consult. And I'll talk a little bit about how that risk is mitigated, but that's always foremost in our minds when we're out there trying to push the development of a new project forward. We had another big pair of decisions come out of our Supreme Court of Canada last year. Those were the Chippewas and Clyde River decisions. There was some uncertainty in our case law as to the circumstances where you had a quasi-judicial tribunal, a regulating approval of some sort, making decisions. Well, if they're quasi-independent, they're not technically an agent of the Crown. If they're going to give a pipeline license or certificate to a company, who's the Crown in that circumstance? So there was some uncertainty in the law as to whether or not that decision that came from that tribunal would be considered Crown conduct. Well, we got confirmation from the Supreme Court, last year that it would be. So back to Haida. Now that you know that a duty is going to be triggered, what do you have to do? What's the content of that duty? What the Supreme Court told us is there's a spectrum, and the spectrum is going to depend on two factors. It's going to depend on the strength of the right or the asserted right. So an established right would be stronger. Something more tenuously asserted might be a little bit weaker. And it's also going to depend on the action that's being contemplated. How severe is the impact on that right going to be? When you take those two factors into account, we've got a spectrum. For more tenuous claims, or there might be a weaker effect on the right or the asserted right, maybe notice is enough with an offer to follow up if there's any concerns. On the other end of the spectrum, where there's an existing right, such as a treaty right, or whether the impact's going to be quite large on that right, the other end of the spectrum, something close to consent or a veto. And the court said it's not a veto, but there's a duty to consult and potentially accommodate. So you need to be engaging with those Indigenous groups. You need to be soliciting their feedback meaningfully and showing that the feedback they give you is something that you're addressing to try and address their concerns. So that case came out in 2004. So we've now had almost 15 years of case law. There's been hundreds of cases trying to interpret what the spectrum means. And it's very fact specific because it depends on the different groups. Most projects won't involve just one group. You've got multiple groups. So what's resulted from that practically is that companies will go out and seek agreement from Indigenous groups through mutual benefit agreements, through participation in their project in some form, through supply chain management type agreements. They will through environmental commitments. That's very important to some Indigenous groups. So even though the duty lies with the Crown, the government, it's actually the energy proponents that are out there undertaking the bulk of this work. And the reason that they're doing that is to try and prevent a court decision on the back end of their project saying, no, what the Crown didn't do wasn't enough. If you have the Indigenous group in support of the project, you're less likely to end up in front of the Federal Court of Appeal defending your project permit. A recent example of this, where that happened, was Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain decision. That just came out on August 30th in Canada. It created a bit of a ripple shock, if I could call it that. So what had happened there was the pipeline had gone to our national federal regulator, the National Energy Board, who had issued an approval for a pipeline from Alberta to BC. It was an existing pipeline that they were going to expand. It's a crude oil pipeline. And the court found no. The Crown, after the National Energy Board had made its recommendations, the Crown then engaged in a further round of consultation with the Indigenous groups, which they called Phase 3 consultation, and they said that fell short of the mark. You guys didn't do enough. You didn't send decision makers out to the communities to talk to them. What you sent was note takers, and you were under the false delusion that you had to accept the draft terms and conditions for what they were. You had the authority to change those, and you didn't change them. So go back and do it all over again. So as it stands today, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion does not have an approval. The Crown's now going through a process through the National Energy Board where they're now considering marine shipping, and then that will lead to a new recommendation from the National Energy Board, and then either parallel to that or subsequent to it, the Crown will be conducting further consultation with the affected Indigenous groups. So that's the risk. The risk is you get your approval and you go to court, and at the end of the day, the court says, no, we're the ones that are going to assess this adequacy, and we agree with the Indigenous groups. You haven't done enough here. So in terms of, I'll try to keep this brief, but in terms of, you know, best practices and what we try to encourage our clients to do when they're going out there on the front end of these projects, number one, do some due diligence, as Gare described. What we call them are preliminary strength of claim analyses. So what we're doing is we're looking at the type of the project, we're looking at the area, we're looking at any existing case law or any other traditional studies that have been done that are out in the public realm, and we're trying to advise our clients, okay, these guys are on the deep end, like this is deep consultation, those are the groups that you should really be focusing hard on. These are the guys in the middle, you need to have meaningful discussions with them too, or these claims, they're pretty weak or they're not really an official group, so notice with an opportunity to follow up is probably adequate there. So we do that right off the bat. The second thing we do is we advise them on capacity funding. As Gare mentioned, a lot of these Indigenous groups don't have capacity to sit down and talk about a project with you. This isn't necessarily their number one concern. A lot of these communities have water issues. There's you know, reserves can be put in a state of emergency because of youth suicide. There can be fentanyl crises going on. There can be all sorts of issues that are unrelated to your project going on. So if they're going to meaningfully engage with you and they want to bring expertise to help advise them, they're going to need capacity. So we help them get that in place before they try to sit down and talk about the project. We recommend early engagement. Do it very early and discuss alternatives with the Indigenous groups. If there's 2 or 3 or 4 different ways to do the project, why not get at that input before you're too far down the path where it's going to be a full reset to do it over again? One of the things I recommend to my clients is to always have dual timelines. So when you're doing your Gantt charts for your project and you're figuring out the key milestones, put another one right beside it, right before it, where you've got a draft of whatever decision it is you're going to make, and go talk to the Indigenous groups about it first. Go get their input. Maybe there is a change you can make before you actually formalize that decision, and document it. Make sure that that's well documented so that you can show at the end of the day, if you do end up in court for some reason, that it was meaningful and that you were having those conversations and that you did have an open mind to adjusting not only your project design, but how you execute it. Maybe you can get across a certain area in the winter and it'll have less of an environmental impact, that type of thing. Or maybe you just need a valve station near this river crossing that you didn't think was important, but now that you found out from that Indigenous group, there's a lot of fishing that takes place there. And then opportunities for project participation. Commercial type stuff, supply chain management, equity, those are the first types of things that come to mind. That's not important to some Indigenous groups. I've sat down with more than one First Nation that said to me, let's park the money talk for now. Let's talk about your environmental commitments first. Because as Cree people, if we're not thinking 7 generations forward, we're not going to be able to get this approved by our community. So I need to be in a position to tell them that this is going to be a good project, not just for us, but for our children, for our children's children, 7 generations down. So you got to be open to a very broad range of conversations, whether it's employment, whether it's training, whether it's scholarships, whether it's community investment. All types of things need to stay on the table early. And then the last tip I give my clients is don't stop knocking on the door with the communities once you've got your project approvals. There's nothing more frustrating, I don't think, from an Indigenous group's perspective than to not hear from that proponent again until they have another project in the queue. You guys say that you want to have lifelong like a relationship with us for the life of the project, but once you've got your approval, we don't see anyone again until you want to expand it or you've got something new to present to us. So think about how to maintain those relationships over the longer term, whether it's community liaisons or just making a point of attending powwows, whatever it is. Like there's always opportunities to get involved with the community. So those are kind of some high-level best practices that we advise our clients on. Just two random, or not random observations, but two other observations of things that I see coming down, coming forward in future discussions with First Nations. One, it's still the exception to the norm, but equity participation in projects is becoming huge. And two, consensus achieving, I would call it. So two big projects recently being pursued in Canada. One's the Coastal GasLink project, which will bring LNG out to LNG Canada's facility in Kitimat. All 20 of the elected Indigenous groups have signed participation agreements for that project, or benefit agreements of some sort. Another more recent one is the Frontier oil sands mine. Melody's here today and she can tell you about that project if you ask her. There's 14 Indigenous groups. All of them have signed agreements with Teck for that project, which is currently before the Alberta Energy Regulator and a joint panel of SIA. So, you know, do you need to get all Indigenous groups on board to get a project approved in Canada? No, but if you do, you could substantially compress your timelines because you're not going to end up in litigation afterwards.
All right. The beauty of the Canada Centre is that you come away better briefed than most Canadians on topics. So thanks very much, Brenden. Olga, I think Gare said the banks are put at the center of these debates. So interested in your perspective on these topics.
So yeah, let me. Is that working? This one? Yeah.
Well, while Olga figures out how to get the PowerPoint running, also there are copies of her presentation at the front as well as other presentations.
So yeah, what can I say after Brenden and Gare? It's very difficult to be a bank, right? So, and definitely hearing what Gare and Brenden were saying. So imagine you're a bank and you removed one step away. And what Brenden was saying, they're advising clients who are the companies, right? And so you're a bank and you have banking deadlines and banking timelines, and you definitely have a very private sector approach to, say, project finance or corporate lending. So what do you do about it? I think the biggest question to lots of people is banking Indigenous people. So what is there together? Yeah, maybe account opening, that's pretty much it, right? So you would think. But as you've heard from Gare and from Brenden, the pressure is on banks, and especially in the United States, where, as Gare was describing, the hope Indigenous peoples basically gave up on the government right now to give a hand, to give full understanding in the reality they've been for a long time. And there is the concept called follow the money, and it doesn't sound positive, but it's what's happening, and it's been happening, I think, after the Codex's pipeline in particular, and that's the reality I feel banks operate in right now. So to give you a little bigger perspective than just follow the money and kind of responding to Indigenous peoples, how we finance projects. So we have a huge commitment to Indigenous peoples, and of course it's particularly to American Indian Alaska Natives, because we're the second by capitalization largest bank in the world. So we definitely care about Indigenous peoples, and since the US-based bank, so we care about US Alaska Natives and American Indians in particular. So just to give you kind of a broader perspective, that we've been in caring or serving the Native communities in the US for 50 years, so that's given. So we serve more than 200 tribal entities in 27 different states in the United States alone, and then we do have development projects including on tribal land. So we have financial services from, as I said, deposits, which is intuitive, to, of course, full range of traditional banking and specific to Indian communities, investments, and recapitalization, etc. So we do have, believe it or not, bankers who understand how Indigenous peoples work. And as Gare said, the study which Foley Hoag carried out did conclude that Indigenous peoples are different peoples and different groups of people with different cultural heritage, etc., therefore need a different approach, including in banking. So then, of course, we, by numbers only, so we have 19 branches and on 7 different reservations in the United States alone. So, yeah, and the final interesting fact, what I found out the number just yesterday, that we do have the Native Americans Network, which is people who work for the bank, and they're, most of them, Indigenous, and there are about 2,000 of them who get together, discuss career, and how can they help their communities back and plan events, etc. So, and another thing which I think not everyone understands that banks also do, and we in particular, we go to the communities and we say, what do you need? So what are your current needs, and what do you want from a bank, right? And that's how we carry out something we call Native American Challenge surveys. So we go out and we talk to them, and then in green, it's not really colored nicely right now in the light, but so the green is what we currently can do after we speak to Native communities, and that's what we come back and structure. So, so just another little example what banks can do. So we do grants, right? So we have grants, and just between 2013 and 17, it was about $23 million in grants. And then last year, we announced a new 5-year commitment, which is $50 million in funding. And that's a brief structure of what it means, so, and what kind of priority topics are there. So it comes from environmental sustainability to marketing support. And we have quite a substantial group of people who do this. And that's commitment we've done, and it's being publicized, so supporting directly in the grant program. So now kind of the key of why I've been invited to speak to you guys is basically, so you're a bank, and all the challenges you just heard from Gare and Brenden. So how do you make sure the companies you give money to actually address concerns and socially and environmentally responsibly? So we do it, first of all, just to, again, a bigger picture, that it's not just Wells Fargo. So all the banks who are big and who actually care about, as Gare was saying, what would happen to their reputation and to the environmental and social impacts their lending generates. So they all, as you see to the very right in the table, they all adopted some sort of policy on Indigenous people. So we have an Indigenous people statement, which is a standalone statement describing what we do and how we do it in terms of Indigenous peoples. But as you can see, all big banks have it, and it's nothing new, and it's been developed, as Gare was saying, within past 10 years or so. So, and then just to give you the energy piece of it, so it's not just an abstract what banks say, yeah, we care about Indigenous people. So we do go and say specifically how we look at oil and gas sector. So we do say that in our particular case, and we just published the environmental social risk management framework, where we say all lending relationship we would have with companies in the oil and gas industry would be reviewed for environmental and social risk. And that's done with my team, which is called Environmental Social Risk Management Team. So that due diligence, you've heard the word, that's what the banks actually do, right? So it's companies who do due diligence, but banks do due diligence as well. So we have a whole process which is put in place in the Environmental Social Management Policy, which is a corporate one. So, and it's a very detailed and thorough process. So, and that comes through all the subsectors. You've heard about pipelines, so that's called midstream. So we look at upstream, which is exploration production. We look at midstream, we look at downstream, which is power and utilities. And we look at integrated companies who do all of that together. And then just to give you an example that all big banks do that. So it's not just our bank. So and kind of to wrap up the introduction in a very specific way. So what do we say in our Indigenous people statement? So we say quite a few things. So one is what I just mentioned, that we do carry out due diligence, and that's not just, again, in oil and gas sector. That energy sector is the topic of today's conversation, but we do it in all industries which ever touch upon Indigenous people. So if it's agribusiness, we'll look at that. If it's mining, we'll look at that as well. So, and then what are we trying to achieve when with this due diligence? We're trying to really ensure that our customers, to whom we're about to lend our money, engage meaningfully and effectively with critical stakeholders. And we also want them to demonstrate the commitment to protect community health, safety and security, and then, of course, cultural identity, environment, and sacred land, and everything what relates to Indigenous people. So that's one thing. So another thing, we actually came to FPIC piece, which you just heard about, the free prior informed consent. And we did say that if we know that the project we're about to finance impacts Indigenous peoples in any geography of this world, including North America, we would ask our customers to demonstrate the compliance with International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 7 and the requirements, which are 4 of them, once they triggered, to demonstrate as well the free prior informed consent obtained from the tribes which were impacted by the project. So I think I'll stop here, and maybe in the conversation I'll show you exactly how we do it, because I think it's important to not just talk about it, but show in practice how we do that during the due diligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll maybe give Olga a chance to catch her breath. And I was interested, Brenden, in maybe, we've talked about an evolution on how project proponents are treating these projects. Have you seen a sort of evolution in terms of how Indigenous communities are engaged in these projects over the last few years? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's when you're dealing with Indigenous groups, it's very difficult to speak in generalities. Every community is very different from one another. But if I violate that and do speak in generalities, I would say most definitely yes. It used to be the norm sort of 10 years ago when you were undertaking the consultation to not explore as many opportunities, or not explore as many opportunities to involve the First Nations in the projects themselves, to ask them to be partners with you. You would always sort of go out there with some capacity funding. You'd bring a PowerPoint presentation and say, this is our project, do you have any concerns with it? That sort of evolved sort of to where we were 7 or 8 years ago, where yes, you would consult and you would provide that capacity funding, but communities wanted to know what are the supply chain opportunities? Can we do some of the clearing for you? Can we have an EMS medical service person on site? Can we get our share of those type of contracts? And then there's been a shift now where it's still the exception to the norm, but now there really is a real conversation happening about partnerships right at the top. Okay, we want to be involved in this project. How can we do it? And the other big change that I've noticed is the type of lawyers that we're dealing with on the other side, the Indigenous Council, aren't the same people that we were dealing with. They're not litigators anymore. We're showing up in boardrooms in Vancouver, and it's the other major law firms, and it's not people that even practice Indigenous law anymore. It's their corporate lawyers that are there to hammer out a deal with you. And that's all happened in the last year or two, where the sophistication level, like there is no concern what the last case said on consultation. Those guys aren't there for that. They're there to hammer out the best deal that they possibly can for their clients. So that's been a very rapid change, and it seems to have all happened at once. There weren't a lot of big firms working for Indigenous groups 2 years ago. Almost all of them are right now.
So, Olga, I think when we were talking before, you said there was sort of pre-DAPL and post-Apple.
Yeah.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about that experience from Wells Fargo's perspective, and then I think that maybe segues nicely into sort of how your approach to risk has evolved going forward.
I'm getting my notes on Depo, so to make sure I don't say anything wrong, right? So I don't know if, does everyone know what Depo is actually? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to tell you how long it is. And so on the banking side, Depo was financed by 17 banks. We were one of them. And if you know banking, there is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So we were tier 3, and the higher the number, the lower you are on the ranking of banks. So we were the tier 3 bank, which is in the banking project finance world, means you have pretty much no say as a syndicated bank in terms of structure of the project, environmental, social impact assessment of the project, and even less so, say, the selection of the independent consultant. So usually the projects with such adverse impacts, they prefer, and it's the equity principles requirement, as Gare was mentioning, to hire an independent environmental engineer or an environmental firm to do an independent environmental review. So if you're a tier 3 bank, you have no say in the terms of reference structuring for that consultant, and you have no selection voice as well. And why I'm saying that, because we've been criticized after the fact when Depo happened that the big bank should have had a say in the selection of consultant, and of course the argument was that the consultant was, wrong or bad, but not our judgment. And then the terms of reference didn't include enough social risk assessment, if you will, and only environmental parts. So that's number one. So in banking, it's not as easy to say if you're part of the syndicate, so come and do dictate as a bank who is selected and how the project is structured. So number two, I think the post-Depo, as Gare was saying, we commissioned the Foley Hoag report as a banking group, and the findings of the report is on one of the slides as well, and Gare summarized them nicely. So it's the going beyond compliance piece, which was recommended for banks to ask their clients to do. And that's what our Indigenous people statements was all about. So we just said, okay, we want as a bank to up our game as well, and we want our clients to do that. So we published the statement in March of 2017, and that became life after Depo for us. So we also doubled the team size, which means if you want to make sure that due diligence works correctly, you need capacity. So we hired more people. We have a human rights lawyer on the team now, which is not unusual for companies to do, but it's very unusual for banks to do. So we learn that it's important to understand social risks when probably environmental impact assessment in the US in particular don't give you enough social risk component by definition. So number two and number three, I think we also started being more client-facing role versus in banks you feel this risk people, they sit somewhere there in the back of the bank and they just look at the papers and numbers. So we started facing clients much more. So we meet with clients, we talk about what we mean by environmental and social risk and what we mean by going beyond compliance and what we mean by best practices, right? So as Gare was again saying, the study found that it's not enough just to comply with the law, to put your head down and say engineers did everything they could. So it's important to have the capacity at the client size. And of course, we ask our clients, so what kind of social expertise you have versus, environmental engineers is a good thing, but what about social people who understand the Indigenous people's voices, if you will, right? And then, and we do it on a regular basis. We meet with clients and we do understand that it's important for banks to talk to clients versus rely on the regulatory processes. So,
Liam, I just want to mention that programmers are tyrants, so we're going to push through. We're not going to do our 2 o'clock break. We're going to push through till about 2:10, so we still got time
Okay,
for this one.
appreciate that. So I was just going to say, I think we've got time for a couple of audience questions, so please be thinking of those, and I'll maybe ask one more and then turn it over. I think we've heard about a few gaps is maybe the general word. Like Gare, you talked about sort of a gap between law and best practice. Brenden, you sort of talked about a gap between consultation and accommodation, and maybe where Canadian courts think we need to be. And then Olga, you talked about sort of a gap between stakeholder expectations and just sort of doing what the sort of minimum regulation required. When you think about where you need to be, do you think if all those gaps are filled, we're headed to the same place, across Canada and the United States? Do you think that if we can address those issues, there's sort of a general understanding of where we need to go? And maybe I'll start with Gare, put him on the spot first.
Yeah, absolutely yes and no. So, which is to say, we do have international normative standards, that are exactly that, international, and there's normative and there's standards. So that is an answer yes right from the start, and we can work towards those, and Indigenous peoples and different governments recognize them. Now, but also, normative standards change over time. We didn't used to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We didn't used to have the UN Guiding Principles. So things we may have, healthcare in this country. That's accepted widely at some point. Things change, and what become normative standards necessarily emerge to reflect changing times and expectations. So I think from my perspective, yeah, we have some absolutely solid, hardcore things that we can all agree on and try and achieve now. But this is a process. It's an evolutionary process, and companies and banks, obviously want to meet compliance. But it's a competitive business being a bank. It's a competitive business being a pipeline company or an oil and gas company, and you want to be looking ahead of the curve and looking around the corner to see what's coming next, so that you can be prepared to keep your business at the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that Canada, because the duty to consult's constitutionally recognized, I think we're always going to be the high watermark. And I think we've got some more big changes that are coming down imminently that are going to bring the standard up even higher. We've got 2 bills before our Senate right now that will have significant effects on the way consultation takes place in Canada. One of those was a private member's bill, Bill 262, that got passed. And what it requires is for the government to take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are in harmony with UNDRIP, so the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that is going to bring in a lot of conversations about FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. How do we implement that? The first try at that seems to be Bill C-69, which is also before our Senate right now. And in the preamble for that bill, there is an express acknowledgement of UNDRIP. So what we've seen in that bill is a lot of codification of some of the best practices that I was talking about: early engagement, repeated engagement, actually having our national regulator go out and consult directly with Indigenous groups. That's all new, and that's why we're all still trying to get our minds wrapped around what does this Bill 262 mean? Will it require full consent? Our courts told us no. Some interpretations of UNDRIP are that it requires it. Others say no, you just need to seek to obtain consent. Maybe that doesn't quite get you to full consent in the context of Article 32. So there's a lot more coming. Like it's not getting any more lenient. It's going to be tougher in Canada from a Indigenous consultation perspective.
I would only add the equator principle piece. So speaking of banks and competitive business, yeah, we've heard this interesting trend before, that when companies say, well, if your bank require too much, you ask too many questions, this environmental social piece, we go to Chinese banks and they don't ask any questions, right? But I feel Equity Principle Association, which is now 94 banks, and for those who don't know what that is, it's the framework which guides project finance, corporate-related project finance, bridge loans for projects, and advisory for projects globally for 94 global banks, which actually represent the majority of project finance market right now. And they said, well, no, we're not going to go down on the requirements, we're actually going to go up, right? And so we're part of the Equator Principles update process as we speak. And I can't give you too many details, but what I can give you is that Depo did raise, and Foley Hoag findings did raise this question. Are designated countries are really better on the social side in terms of law? And the answer was no. Probably that gap needs to be closed, and that's what, for better or worse, the Gap Equity Principle Association is trying to close. And whether it becomes FP Global or not, it's to be seen, but the fact of the matter is the human rights component is going to be articulated much better. That's for sure. And then the requirements for designated countries after Depo going to be strengthened for sure. And then the aspect of how the social risk will be played out and the requirements for all countries will be strengthened for sure. So we'll see in August 2019 what that will be, but that's definitely the gap closing for 94 banks globally.
So we've got 4.5 minutes, which makes it imperative that you ask your question in the form of a short question. So I'll maybe take 2 to start right here, and then maybe to the right there.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University, trying to start an Indigenous Studies program at Georgetown. And I have a question for Brenden about the ways that consulting plays out. In other words, if you could give a couple of examples when a community is in division, whether it's over issues of jobs versus environment or other kinds of tensions, could you give us a little bit more about what that process is actually like?
Yeah, so
So I'll just pause you there, and we'll maybe take one on the right.
okay.
Bob Icord, Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Thank you for doing this panel. It's very important. As I look at energy development around the world, the issues related to indigenous peoples and ethnic groups and regional issues and how they benefit or don't benefit from these large mega infrastructure projects is becoming increasingly important. So as we look at Kitimat, which is the largest energy project ever in Canada, which reportedly has agreement from 20 nations, can you tell us more about the nature of those agreements and the political environment in which they were formed, because you had strong opposition from the Green Party on climate goals, et cetera. So I'd be interested if you could add any more, especially on tax or other kinds of issues that affect the distribution of benefits and revenues from such a project.
Sure. Okay. So I'll deal with the first question first in terms of dealing with division within the communities. The case law tells us that when we're out there consulting with a particular Indigenous group, it's really their leadership that we need to focus on. So a lot of the Indigenous communities have consultation coordinators, but we need assurances from the chief and council that we're dealing with the correct people. So that in practice, the initial correspondence would go to the chief and council, who would then direct us to who they'd want us to deal with. So that kind of shields both the Crown and the proponent from any dissent that might be going on within the community. But the big X factor here is that a lot of the Indigenous groups we deal with are Indian Act First Nations. And if they govern their elections as is the sort of general layout, they can have their own customized election processes, but it's only a 2-year election cycle under the Indian Act. So these consultations can go on for years, so you could end up with 2, 3, 4 different sets of leadership, and leadership have very different views on projects frequently, so it does create a real tangible challenge to try and get something done if you know that you're heading into an election cycle. In relation to the Coastal Gas project and the 20 deals, I can't share a lot of the specifics with you because we actually assisted that, our firm did, but I can tell you what's available publicly. Between the 20 groups, there was about $400 million in guaranteed opportunities for supply chain management type activities.
All right, so I've got...
And one other detail was that took 6 years of negotiations to get there.
I've got 45 seconds left. Is that
do, yeah.
okay? So I
Take a
Use
minute
them
and a half
wisely.
if
I
you
will.
like.
I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a rhetorical question, which is there anywhere else in DC where this kind of coming together of Canada and U.S. exports to share perspectives on a shared challenge could take place? So congratulations to Laura and her team here at the Wilson Center. I think this is a really important conversation. Looking forward to the rest of the panels. And with that, I'll give you an opportunity to thank our panelists, and then I think I'm allowing you out for coffee. So.
No.
Oh.
No, oh.
Oh no. Spoke too soon.
Yeah, yes. Thank you and approbation, but we're going to do an Irish coffee break. I just made that up. I'm not sure if that's really the term at all, but there is coffee. There are restrooms. If you need them, if and when you need them, please go ahead and take advantage of that. But we are going to go right into the next panel so that we are efficient, because you know there's a glorious reception hosted by Liam
that's right.
and Aaron and Rachel at the embassy, which will
There'll
give
be
you
better
much
drinks than coffee.
with better drinks than our mediocre coffee. So thank you, Liam. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.